Good afternoon and welcome to the LSE South Asia Center. My name is Nilanjan Sarkar, and I am the Deputy Director here at the Center in the London School of Economics. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this afternoon's event, a very special event in a series of events that we are doing to mark the Golden Jubilee of Bangladesh's independence. As it happens, today is also the anniversary of the Amphan cyclone, and I am delighted to say that we have a very special program with a panel of eminent speakers, and we will be looking at the question of climate change and what the world can learn from Bangladesh about it. But before I get on to all that, may I welcome all of you who are watching online. I can see several of you are watching at the moment. Thank you very much for joining. Thank you also to those of you who signed up. And the events in this series, which are called Bangladesh at 50, run alongside a series of special blog posts that we have been publishing since January, once a month, around the middle of the month, roughly on the 14th or 15th, also focusing on Bangladesh. And it is a commemorative blog post written by a string of eminent experts and personalities. May I request all of you, when you have the time, to look at our blog post, South Asia at LSE, and I'm sure you will enjoy reading about it. The event today is titled Climate Change, What Bangladesh Can Teach the World. And the event is, as you know, being live streamed on YouTube. For the benefit of the audience on YouTube, please know that you are very welcome to ask questions to the panelists. I can see that the chat function has now been enabled. You are welcome to ask a question to a particular panelist or to the entire panel, and I will pose them at the appropriate time to the panel. Had this event been on site, LSE's regulations are that members of the audience have the right to not disclose their identity while asking a question. As a result, when I pose the questions, I will not be taking your names, but of course your names will be available on YouTube for others to see. I should also add a clarification over here, and that is that in last week's event, I had mistakenly said that the questions will get deleted once the event gets over. That was incorrect. I had misunderstood information that had been given to me. The questions remain, but the chat box can be unmuted when it is replayed. A recording of this event will be available from tomorrow morning on our website in the events archive for those who may not be able to view it today, to view it later, or for others who may want to view it later in any case. If you are going to tweet, then please do tag us at SAsiaLSE. On the upside of online events is that we are able to bring together a panel like today's, which it really is our privilege. Apart from Professor David Lewis, and whom I will introduce just now, all our panelists are in fact in Bangladesh at the moment, and this would not have been possible had this been an on-site event. So over the last year, I think we have had the privilege and benefited greatly from being able to convene panels where we have had experts from across the world at the same time, across not just place, but also time zones. It is now my very pleasant task to introduce the members of today's panel discussion. May I begin with introducing my colleague, David Lewis, who is Professor of Social Policy and Development at LSE, and his research expertise is on Bangladesh. His main research interests have been in international development policy and NGO civil society policy, but over the years, and especially more recently, as it invariably happens, his interests have expanded and diversified. Salimul Haq is director at International Center for Climate Change and Development, known more popularly as ICCCAD in Dhaka, and is also professor at Independent University, Bangladesh. Khushi Kabir is secretary and coordinator of the NGO Nijera Kori. We do it ourselves in English in Dhaka. Farah Kabir is country director of ActionAid Bangladesh, also based in Dhaka. Finally, Dr. Shahpar Selim is an LSE alumnus, I never forget to say that, and is currently Mission Environmental Officer and Climate Integration Lead at USAID in Dhaka. We have discussed ahead of this event that The order in which we're going to proceed is I'm going to invite David to make some opening remarks, after which Dr. Salimul Haq, who has co-organized this panel with David, will also make some initial remarks. After that, we will invite Khushi Kabir to speak. After that, Farah Kabir, and finally, Shahpar Selim. Once Shahpar has finished speaking, David will open up the panel for discussion, both amongst panelists, and by that time, if we have questions, then I will pose them to the panel alongside David's discussion. So without any further ado, David.
Thank you very much. And let me just begin my brief opening remarks by thanking Nilanjan Sarkar and the South Asia Centre for facilitating this session today, and our 4 speakers for giving up their time. I'm really looking forward to the panel and really looking forward to everybody's contributions. So when I first started thinking about this panel, I had a few related ideas in mind. The idea that the people of Bangladesh have long been engaged in managing complex environmental problems at many different scales, from individual and household level to community to national and regional and global, I guess. And also the fact that Bangladesh is now a country that plays a leading role in international climate action and diplomacy and policy. And also, given the 50th anniversary year, I also felt that this topic was a very good way to draw attention to Bangladesh's achievements and its importance, especially given the fact that it still continues to have, in the words of Naomi Hussein, a light imprint on the international imagination. Now, the anniversary and the many events and discussions and reflections that have taken place have given lots of opportunity to reflect on Bangladesh's past, which is entirely right and proper. But I think what's important and exciting about a focus on climate action is that it's a topic that leads us to consider the present and the future, and with some urgency. One of the key lessons for the rest of the world from a panel like this, I think, is to send the message that Bangladesh is not a victim, as is so often implied in the international media. And a focus on climate action shows that it's a source of ideas, of expertise, and of knowledge. The country is a key international actor, in other words, in the struggle to address what is the greatest challenge that faces humankind in the 21st century. But as we will also hear, Bangladesh's problems are very real and they're likely to get worse. And despite its own active role in adapting to climate change, the rest of the world, and especially we in the industrialized world, have a moral duty to assist Bangladesh in its efforts to adapt and to take action to mitigate, as Manoj Roy, Joseph Hanlon, and David Hume have written in their still very relevant 2016 book, Bangladesh Confronts Climate Change. So without further ado, let me hand over the floor to our speakers this afternoon, and I look forward very much to our discussion on this incredibly important topic. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Before I speak, I just thought I would tell you that we have audiences from literally all over the world watching us at the moment. May I introduce Salimul Haq, who is director at the International Center for Climate Change and Development, known more popularly as ICCCAD, in Dhaka, and is also professor at the Independent University, Bangladesh, and is a co-organizer of the event. Dr. Haq, please speak. You have about 8 minutes.
Thank you very much, Nilanjan, and thank you very much, David, for organizing this event and inviting myself and my center to co-organize it with you. So I'm going to say 3 sets of remarks. Firstly, to take up on the 50th year anniversary, not just of Bangladesh as a country, but also of UK-Bangladesh relations as well. And in my second set of remarks, I'll be talking about how that relationship might evolve over the coming decades, perhaps the next 50 years. And then thirdly, about the topic of what Bangladesh can contribute to global knowledge and expertise and tackling the issue of climate change. So the first set of remarks I want to make is the 50 years that we have passed as a country, looking to the next 50 years, are very, very different. We are now in a planetary emergency. It's actually a multiple planetary emergency, but climate change, in my view, is the number one planetary emergency. We also have a biodiversity emergency with about 1 million species being lost. And right now we are living through a health emergency with the pandemic of COVID-19 hitting us all over the world. So this concept of global emergency has come very starkly in our faces. And the world going forward is a very different world from the one we left behind. I would argue that the year 2021 is going to be remembered as the turning point in many different aspects. Obviously, it will be remembered as the year of COVID-19, but it'll also be remembered as the year we went into a climate change world. And I'll illustrate that by citing the example of Cyclone Amphan, Super Cyclone Amphan, which hit our part of the world exactly 1 year ago today. It became a super cyclone while it was in the Bay of Bengal because the sea surface temperature was elevated by over 2 degrees above normal, which is what causes cyclones to become super cyclones. And it initially hit West Bengal, Kolkata, and then turned into Bangladesh and hit us. Fortunately, both India and Bangladesh have one of the best and most sophisticated early warning systems and evacuation programs in the world. Around 3 million people were successfully warned and evacuated. They did not die. Previous super cyclones that have occurred in past decades have caused deaths in the hundreds of thousands of people. And so that is a major, major achievement of Bangladesh in terms of our reduction of human deaths because of cyclones. However, now, a whole year after that, many tens of thousands of people who survived the cyclone have not been able to go home. Their homes have been destroyed or their land has been salinized by seawater. They're either living on embankments near their homes or in the slums of Khulna, which is the nearest town, or in the slums of Dhaka. So while we have managed to save their lives, we have not managed to save their livelihoods. And this in the climate change parlance is something we call loss and damage from climate change. We are still seeing the impacts of loss and damage, even though we've been very good at saving human lives from the impacts of cyclones. So adaptation to climate change is a work in progress. Bangladesh has probably got one of the best and most sophisticated early warning systems, and we have brought down human deaths to very minimum numbers very successfully, but nevertheless, a lot remains to be done in terms of reducing loss and damage going forward. The second item I want to pick on is the relationship between the UK and Bangladesh, which obviously goes back a long time into colonial history. But the last 50 years, as two independent countries, it has had a number of journeys together. The relationship has been primarily the UK being a relatively rich country, the head of the Commonwealth. Bangladesh is a Commonwealth country as well, has been one of the biggest aid givers to Bangladesh. The UK, Bangladesh has been one of the biggest recipients of bilateral aid from DFID originally, now FCDO. And the relationship has been largely based on aid giving and aid receipt for development purposes. But at the same time, there have also been a number of other kinds of relationships going forward. I will pick on two particularly important relationships that I want to highlight. The first one is the Bangladeshi diaspora in the UK. We now have several million Bangladeshi British people, particularly a younger generation who were born and brought up in the UK, but of Bangladeshi origin. These are no longer migrants coming from Bangladesh, primarily from Sylhet region of Bangladesh, who went and established themselves and very largely developed the British food, Bangladeshi cuisine in the UK through the restaurants. But their children, their boys and girls have become professionals. They are British citizens. They are now members of parliament. They are in business. But they represent a very important cohort of British citizens who are closely linked to Bangladesh. And I spent a lot of time in the UK and met with many of them. And this second generation, this younger generation, I found are very interested in climate change. They're not interested in the old politics that their parents used to be involved in. Awami League, BNP, the parents were still involved in Bangladeshi politics, but the kids aren't. But they are interested in climate change, and they are interested in knowing what's happening in Bangladesh and wanting to do things about it. And so that constitutes, in my view, a very important cohort that we should be investing our effort to reach out to. And another foundation that I would like to pick up on is the relationship between British universities and Bangladeshi universities, and particularly scholars, British scholars, Bangladeshi scholars. And I speak as one of them. You mentioned that Shahpar was a LSE alumni. I'm an Imperial College alumnus myself. I still teach at Imperial College. And there are hundreds of us British alumni in the UK, and we've maintained our relationships. David is a very old friend, and similarly, we have many friendships amongst academia in British and Bangladeshi universities, which have continued, and we've been working on a sort of ad hoc manner on the issue of development so far. I'm going to argue that we now have to build on that and start working on the twin global problems of climate change and development. So poverty and climate change are now a two-sided coin, a global problem in which the UK and Bangladesh can collaborate going forward, particularly on knowledge and knowledge creation and sharing that with the rest of the world. So my final point then leads me to my final point, which is the future relationship of the UK and Bangladesh. It needs to be one of partnership. We will join forces. It's no longer one giving to the other. It's both learning from each other and tackling a global problem. The global problem being poverty on the one hand, climate change on the other hand. Bangladesh has a huge amount of experience in this arena. Bangladesh currently, our Prime Minister chairs a group of nearly 50 of the most vulnerable countries called the Climate Vulnerable Forum. We are doing a lot of outreach in terms of South-South knowledge sharing, particularly focusing on locally led adaptation, community-based adaptation, of which several of my subsequent speakers are some of the best proponents and most experienced people in the whole world who can share that knowledge, not just UK, Bangladesh, but South-South with other vulnerable countries going forward. So I'll end with that note of optimism going forward, notwithstanding that these are huge problems that are going to affect us and it's not going to be easy. But I remain optimistic that we will be able to tackle them effectively, and that the UK-Bangladesh partnership is a very solid basis for us to go forward, and particularly in this year with the context of the COP26 coming up, hopefully in November, held in Glasgow, will give us that momentum. There's already talks going on between the UK government and Bangladesh government. I would like to expand that to a whole of society relationship rather than just government to government relationship. But let us build on that and take that forward. I'll stop there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Haq. Thank you very much for those very important points. I acknowledge that you are an alumnus of Imperial, but I was not going to announce it. I would still stick to announcing only Shahpar as LSE alumnus, but we are so delighted to have you. It is my very pleasant duty now to introduce once again Khushi Kabir, who is Secretary and Coordinator of the NGO Nijera Kori, which is We Do It Ourselves in Dhaka. We are going to begin Ms. Kabir's presentation with a very short documentary. It's a little less than 2 minutes, after which Ms. Kabir will speak for about 6 or 7 minutes. We'll play the film now.
Yeah.
Great. Please speak now, Ms. Kabir.
Yeah, thank you. So I'd like to thank Nilanjan and David for both for organizing and inviting me to speak. So Bangladesh at 50 and what Bangladesh can teach the world. The video we showed you didn't have the voice. Unfortunately, it was, but it had the titles, subtitles, so you could see. Basically, I'll just give a very short idea about this video so that it falls into context of what this issue and what I'm going to talk about. In the southwest of Bangladesh, in the Khulna region, in the late 80s, shrimp agriculture took over agriculture. And polders were built to supposedly for the shrimp, but later on, people decided to shrimp owners. These are mainly people from the cities and for exports, take over these areas and grow just shrimp aquaculture, the tiger prawns that you get to eat in your countries, in many countries in the north. And so, which meant that the people of the area was completely devastated. They had no jobs, they had no land, they had no fuel, water, no more agricultural land, no more vegetables to be able to grow, no chicks and ducks, etc., to be able to cultivate. So their whole lifestyle went totally awry. Now, except in this one area which is called the Polder 22, because the Dutch helped build many of these embankments, and which were called polders. So in Polder 22, there was a big movement against the advent of the shrimp aquaculture, and a woman was killed and in 1990, and as a result of which that polder remained shrimp-free throughout because of people's movement and collective action. The people of the area used to maintain the embankment themselves, but a couple of years ago, which I won't mention, the government took it over and decided to take over maintenance through another committee that they set up, who did not do their job. So for the first time, despite Sidr and Ayla and other very large storms, this island remained absolutely untouched during all the other cyclones, except during the Amphan, because at the Amphan, the cracks had begun to already appear in the embankments. So the people themselves decided to take over and work day and night to ensure, and this is at the time of the coronavirus being at its peak. It was just begun, that they decided to take over and build that embankment, which they managed to drain out the water, which they managed to. When people asked if they needed any support for relief, rehabilitation, housing, etc., they said no, they did not want to. It's their land, their area, and they want to be independent, which is what Nijera means, to do it ourselves. And so I thought that it would be a good way to begin what we were planning to talk about. So what it is that, there's a lot of debates about how, climate change, as David says, is at the receiving end of, as Bangladesh is looked at as at the receiving end only. But, the whole question is that I think what we need to do is look at what is climate change, what is because of global warming, etc., and how much of it is because of maldevelopment that we ourselves are planning. So I would like to raise the question of whether how much of what is happening in Bangladesh is a result of external issues of the global climate change and global warming, and how much of it is as a result of what we ourselves are doing to in terms of increasing ecological and changes, which are quite disastrous for a lot of people, which we are not able to handle. And that is what Nijera Kori basically works on. It works on working with the marginalized, landless, the ones who are usually excluded from all kinds of development, planning, discussion, and other processes. And they happen to be quite a large majority in the country. Not only are the rural people more the majority in our country, but poverty level is not as low as we would like it to be, even if you're moving into a middle income range. And it's not, and I will just say that the income rich and the poor has increased tremendously, and that the extreme poor is still very vulnerable, and they are very poor. And the last year's COVID-19 situation has exacerbated the poverty more. Now, what responses do we have? We don't have answers, but what can we teach the world? We can teach the world what our responses have been. Nijera Kori works in organizing these poorest communities to force just not self-help groups, but also in terms of being able to be aware of what their rights are, constitutional rights and rights as citizens, and their entitlements, and to ensure that they get it. So it's not, Nijera Kori does not provide services and any other kinds of handouts or for them to be more dependent on us, but to help them grow into their own organizations where they themselves can take up the issues and can then really make changes and decide. And that they have done time and time again, whether it is corruption at the local government level and ensuring that the money is given back and the projects are done as it should be done, or like what you saw in the video, taking up action themselves to ensure that their land is saved, whether it is violence against women, whether it is asking for accountability from elected officials and government officials. So as these communities get stronger, and what Nijera Kori tries to do is believe in collective organization and for collective voice. And when 75% of the people in a village and in an area are organized, they form a committee, which means they're a big enough number to be able to make a voice. And that makes the difference. So when maldevelopment is about taking or any new kinds of projects for development, act, etc., the people who were usually ignored are beginning to take charge and ensure that their lives are changing. So in this situation, we also discuss a lot about what is climate change and what it means. So it's global, and whereas Bangladesh may not be contributing globally to the global warming, but Bangladesh within the country, what it is doing, we have to look at how it is affecting our own ecosystems and how it is affecting all our systems. Like the area we showed the film on is just beyond, I'll stop now in a little while, just in a sentence, it's just where the Sundarban, the mangrove forest ends. So it's a very sensitive area. And that's where there's a huge coal-fired power plant being built, where there were a lot of demonstrations. So this is being disastrous. So are people in the country need to take up. And I think no nation is an island. And discussions like this are so important that we're talking about think globally, but act locally, but we need the global support to give us the information that we require, the scientific and the other kinds of information that is required. And we need
I think we have lost the connection with Ms. Kabir. What I suggest we do is if we move on to Farah to speak, and
the next 50 years of Bangladesh will be enough.
Okay.
Yeah.
Khushi, I should tell you that we lost you in between, so we couldn't hear you.
Sorry.
But that's all right. That's all right. What we'll do is, David, perhaps we could come back to this in the discussion where we can then go back to the question of maldevelopment and also the question of the Sundarbans. But why don't we? Yeah, why don't we?
I think we got almost everything, Khushi. It was just your last sentence that we missed, but I think we can piece it together. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, we heard you till you talked about thinking globally but acting locally, but we can come back to other bits of it later on, I'm sure. May I now once again introduce Farah Kabir, who is country director of ActionAid Bangladesh and is based in Dhaka. Farah, please speak. You have about 8 minutes.
Thank you, Nilanjan and David and ICCCAD for inviting me. When we were discussing how best to share our experience, there was a reference that how ActionAid has been working on the ground, and our work, if I share with you, is basically on 3 dimensions. One is, of course, very community and grounded in terms of the awareness raising, and for us, actually it started in Bangladesh as a part of their humanitarian response, a response to floods and cyclones. But by 2007, it was quite evident that unless we have an integrated approach, all the development initiatives were being impacted very negatively. And it was important to understand how climate change was impacting, the intensity, the frequency, the changes in climate and all related issues, and how strongly poverty and environmental degradation are connected. So we basically spent a huge amount of time working with the community together to learn from them and to learn and capture the indigenous knowledge. One of the approach that ActionAid has always taken is putting women at the center. So community leadership, women's leadership was at the focus of all our learning and our journey. And it has been also at the center of the entire adaptation journey that ActionAid has been working on with the community. And that's what Bangladesh has put forward in the global arena. Now, there came a point after a certain level of adaptation that how much are we going to adapt? So the global crisis, the global change, and we are at the receiving end of it. Just as Khushi was saying that there's maladaptation, but there's the huge world out there that has caused the climate change, and we are at the receiving end of it, and we are being impacted very negatively. So it became quite clear that we need to do action research, we need to prepare, understand, and create policy briefs and so on. So there's the normative part that we also took up. And it was both a learning for us and the community, but also working with experts and learning from them and trying to link the science with the people and connecting it. So that sometimes took years. For instance, there used to be a standing order on disaster preparedness, and it took us 15 years to turn that into an act, a legislation, and we had to, really persist there. So one of our learnings was that persistence and bringing in the evidence was one way of doing the normative work, and not many NGOs and INGOs can have the luxury of doing it because it's a funding issue, it's sometimes it's projectized, but we did manage. So that's where our contribution was in terms of the normative work, taking it, and it was not just about the adaptation. It was recognizing climate change and taking it and bringing it to the policymakers. And some of the suggestions that we put forward were like creating the trust fund. And that the whole journey of the trust fund that policymakers and political actors now celebrate globally has come from the civil society. It's really come from our years of our advocacy and lobbying, We then tried to pilot the adaptation, and the recognitions came from UNFCCC as CCA and DRR implementation. But we also, as I said, put women at the center, and we took the women's voice, women's agency to even the COP climate negotiations, and they were there discussing how it impacts them. You know, they wanted to know that when they go to sleep, they live on the coastal areas, or they live on the river embankments. When they wake up in the morning, a portion of their house is gone, it's disappeared, and they have to move 25 times or 26 times in their life. So the women, the community was capable of asking and placing these, the evidence and demanding. So that was one of our way of working and putting climate change, adaptation on the agenda. But we did not stop there, because as I was saying, that there's a limit to adaptation. So where do we go? What are the innovations? How do we come up with alternatives? That was also something we pursued over the last 10, 15 years. And it meant influencing also at the international arena. So we took our evidence, our learnings to the international arena and shared what were the learnings, what was the outcome, how the community had adapted, what were the new ways of, and encouraging, investing. So whatever little resources we had, we invested in communities. We gave it to young people to come up with innovations. And because one thing was very clear, that we needed an integrated approach for development and climate change and adaptation and mitigation. And otherwise, this was not going to be, we would not get to sustainable development or the transformational change in the context of Bangladesh or any other country. And these learnings, as we were sharing, were also picked up by other parts of the world. And ActionAid being a federation, it's present in 45 countries. So our learnings were transferred, were shared through Resilience Hub. We created Resilience Hub. ActionAid Bangladesh took up the delegation of climate justice for ActionAid as a federation. And so in Malawi, Cambodia, Tanzania, wherever we had these learnings, we were doing cross-sharing, cross-fertilizations of the learning. And so there was South-South collaboration, community-community collaboration learning. But bringing you back to the normative and the global part, it was very important to be present at these negotiations, at the discussions, because climate politics was way beyond our understanding, but that impacted our lives. So we needed to understand the discourse. We worked closely with the scientific group. We worked closely with the politicians, and then started putting up suggestions. And at the negotiations, when the different parties, the government and at the UN went, there was an interest of the government to talk about climate finance. There was an interest to talk about adaptation and mitigation. The missing link was always gender justice, climate justice and gender. And that's where we made a huge contribution. You know, we went in there with whatever understanding, knowledge we had of the existing patriarchal systems, the gender discrimination, the inequality and injustices, and tried to put that through the feminist lens and analyze how climate change was impacting on an already existing vulnerable situation for communities. And that was our contributions, because at that time, the government did not have designated negotiators or designated government officials in these negotiations. So ActionAid kept working on that. And I think in the last 5 or 6 years, we have seen that shift of government putting, giving importance, and government officials picking it up. And then, of course, we were also taking up the issues of loss and damage, because for us, the community is impacted in such a way that it's not about academic exercise, it's not about tomorrow when the rest of the world's going to act, it's about now. and what they were losing, how they were losing, and how were they going to cope with it. I mean, we have all had coping mechanism, but I think we need to go beyond the coping and really acknowledging the loss and damage and trying to address them. Even though the Annex 1 countries or the developed countries have an allergy to the word compensation, and I'm sure you all know how the agreements went on and on beyond the allocated time because of some of these issues, but we did get them there. So on the issue of gender and climate justice, on the issue of loss and damage, it took years of advocacy and lobbying and persistently being present and staying on the ground. So I think Bangladesh, if it wishes, or if anyone wants to study Bangladesh at its 50 years, these are the contributions that we can highlight. And this is why I think the recognition that Bangladesh is very good at disaster risk management. Yes, there are issues, there are many loopholes yet we have managed to bring down the mortality level, the human casualty level. We still have to look at how we manage other resources and assets. The innovation part of climate change, it's now a part of if you look at some of the normative changes or the policy influencing, it's very much into our 8 5-year plan or the 5-year plan before that. The recognition, then the attempt to redistribute some of the budget. These are the changes that's happening. In terms of the social protection area, recognizing that climate change, vulnerable groups exist and they need to be supported. Sometimes it might be a tokenism, sometimes it might be a political, grand gesture. But today, climate vulnerable groups are being given assets, are being given homes to stay in. Again, these are examples that we set up over the years, that it's not just about responding and giving food support or livelihood support, it's also about assets. And we created those and we've given it and shown examples of that in different coastal areas of providing the community with that. We influenced the design of the shelters and so many other things. So I'm happy to go on, but I think when we get to the question and answers, on one level, we do have problems, but on another level, I'm very proud of what Bangladesh has done in the area of disaster risk reduction, disaster management, disaster planning, and also, the community in terms of dealing and addressing the climate vulnerable issues. But if the world leadership does not act, we just can't do it ourselves. It has to be, the recognition has to be there that it needs an integrated approach to development, to sustainability, and the recognition of the climate crisis. And on top of that, when we have the pandemic, I think the SDG, the Sendai, and the Paris agreements, they all need to factor the pandemic and come up with whether it's new pieces of work or it's additional, but we need to review and build on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much. That was very interesting. And I'm sure we will come back to some of these issues in the discussion. May I announce for those who are watching on YouTube that if you would like to ask any questions, we're getting close to the discussion phase. So if you would like to ask any questions, please do post them on in the chat box, and I will post them to the panelists. And once again, you're welcome to ask a question to a particular panelist or to the complete panel, and they will answer accordingly. Finally, I am delighted once again to introduce our final speaker, Dr. Shahpar Selim, who's an LSE alumnus, who's awarded her PhD from here in the London School of Economics, and is currently Mission Environmental Officer and Climate Integration Lead at USAID in Dhaka. Shahpar, please speak now. You have about 10 minutes.
Thank you so much to the LSE South Asia Center and ICCCAD for having me this evening. My talk is surrounded on cultural expressions of our climate struggle. Bangladesh is one of the most climate impacted countries in the world. However, this also means that climate change has helped equip many generations with lessons on how to deal with natural disasters. This experience may offer useful resources for the future, not only for Bangladesh, but beyond. Building on this argument, I would like to consider the role of arts and culture as useful resources that can inform climate policy and programming. Since climate impacts our cultural lives so deeply, my question is, why is contemporary culture largely silent in climate policy making? Bangladesh's overall climate strategy has been to build institutional capacity, mainstream climate thinking across sectors, and invest in climate adaptive solutions like state-of-the-art early warning systems, cyclone shelters, etc. However, local vernacular expressions of culture have tended to be sidelined in this process in favor of Western scientific knowledge. This is very evident in the case of climate predictions or prescriptions that are based on IPCC reports. Their technocratic Western-generated knowledge underpins much of what we take to be rational project design. A lack of cultural knowledge dehumanizes such insights. So has everything in life been culture deaf so far? No, on the contrary. There has been a visible rise in participatory approaches in climate adaptation. For example, the Community Risk Assessment CRA tool, which is widely used in Bangladesh for disaster risk management and preparedness, puts the local community front and center. It acknowledges that if a disaster strikes, local communities are the first responders, that each community has unique strengths, weaknesses, and needs, and that it is them who should have an important voice in planning how to react in a disaster situation. But CRA-type tools are not the cure-all. Studies show that even with proper risk information, adequate dissemination, and response capacities, under real-life conditions, response priorities emerge differently among various groups due to their differences in risk perception. And this is directly related to culture. After Cyclone Foni and Amphan, newspapers reported that Bangladeshi families living close to the shelters were reluctant to evacuate their homes, resulting in unnecessary deaths and cyclone damage. Patriarchal cultural norms prevalent in countries like Bangladesh mean that some women simply feel reluctant to go to cyclone shelters unaccompanied by male relatives. Some people tend to view cyclones as divine punishment. Lower levels of literacy also makes villagers more likely to feel alienated from formal scientific warnings, which underscores the importance of humanizing climate science away from jargon and towards more vernacular, accessible terms. So what's next? As the conversation between different forms of knowledge keeps on continuing, it is not surprising that climate events are increasingly being reflected in popular culture. Recent novels by Amitav Ghosh and Arif Anwar are inspired by the 1970 Bhola cyclone. Cyclone Aila, which happened in 2009, inspired a movie called Shunte Ki Pao about a family recovering from Aila. A 2019 animated film for kids was released about a young boy who learns about rising sea levels, starts a global movement to tax fossil fuels, and helps combat greenhouse gas emissions. A special shout out here to fellow LSE alum Qazi Zishan Hassan for producing the children's short film. The common meeting point between climate challenges and cultural expression has also inspired Bangladeshi development workers. Folk songs and street theater are part of the awareness-raising tools of NGOs working on disaster management, climate-smart agriculture, and so on. But the most interesting thing that I want to talk to you today about is the Bangladeshi practice of potgan. These are short musical theater performances by rural artists done with the help of scrolls, which are illustrated by the folk artists themselves. Scrolls tell a story visually. They are unwrapped as the plot progresses during the performance, while folk singers narrate the heart-rending stories through song. Pot performers tell and retell timeless stories that combine themes of deep religious faith and human survival in uncertain environments that are all too familiar and relatable to the villagers. Development agencies have recently begun to use potgan theater performances as well. The script is usually written by the performers who have been briefed by development experts. A very interesting example of this was an initiative of the Dhaka University Theatre Department in collaboration with Manchester University's Global Development Institute in 2016. Following 2 years of research on urban climate change, They created an interactive pod gun script that illustrated not only the flood impacts, but also the slum dynamics in solving the problems. Their performances reached over 7,000 people, including slum dwellers, policymakers, practitioners, students, and the general public. There is no denying that such interactive and culture-specific formats connect deeply with the audience. In fact, their study showed that after the pod gun, participants reported much higher retention. Similar efforts in Indonesia, Pakistan, and India have been reported where climate artists are trying to find ways to bridge the gap between science and the arts. They want to use their work to inspire audiences to make eco-friendly life changes. So now a good question is, how do we now reach out to the climate policymakers? I would like to argue that the pod gun format that we talked about can be used to draw attention of policymakers and public office holders to climate issues and to help build situated responses. And vice versa as well. Folk expressions can be used by scientists and experts to communicate in a much more accessible manner with ordinary people. Additionally, at the project design stage, we can take an ethnographic mode of culture and inquiry through forms of immersive collaboration with stakeholders that will help people understand how global processes such as an unseasonable heat wave are expressed in local languages and what is reflected in changing cultural practices. My fellow panelists have already given us some very good examples of how these community consultative processes have benefited project design. For example, a discussion with village elders on how certain seasonal markers such as bird migration or markings on tree barks have changed over time would help contextualize climate adaptation. Such companion modeling can be used to explore knowledge systems in ways that can better integrate traditional and scientific perspectives. The Global Commission on Adaptation 2019 report applauded Bangladesh's achievements in reducing climate-induced damage. The report cites Bangladesh as a success story for placing the locus of adaptation at both subnational and national scale, and for its use of a participatory, transparent, and gender-inclusive approach. Climate change has shaped our lives and will continue to challenge us. We have to respond using the many strands we have at the policy level, at the scientific level, at the community level, and also at the personal level. And we will need to hark back to earlier experiences through which we have navigated our previous climate challenges. I would like to leave you with two lessons. Firstly, for policymakers, they should be wary of listening only to expert narratives in relation to climate change, privileging only certain kinds of voices, or designing projects with only a particular rational response in mind. Secondly, the case of Bangladesh demonstrates that culture is a powerful tool for advocacy and consensus building. A broader recognition of this insight can not only help to improve interventions in Bangladesh, but can positively inform work in other climate vulnerable nations as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shahpar. That was very, very interesting. We have some questions trickling in, but I'm going to invite David to start off the discussion first. I will pose the questions as they keep coming. But David, would you like to now begin?
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. And thank you to everybody for such an interesting combination of perspectives and insights. So I've got a few, I'll spend a couple of minutes and maybe have a couple of questions and then we'll open it up. But starting with Salim, I think, you set the scene incredibly usefully, I think. And at the end of your talk, you mentioned what you called a whole of society approach. And I think that's such a nice phrase that in a sense it really underpins the session today. But I wanted to ask you maybe to say a little bit more about how you see the whole of society approach. And actually, it leads me to a general question for everybody, which is that everybody's talked about civil society, everybody's talked about the government, but unless I missed it, nobody has mentioned the private sector. I mean, Khushi mentioned the private sector in the sense of shrimp production and the malign influence. But let's, I would love to just get people's views about that. Khushi, thank you for a very powerful presentation. And the film, I think, really helped to bring home the realities of what we're talking about and the interplay between the local, the national, and the global. One of the things you mentioned, Khushi, was you talked about maldevelopment. You used that term, maldevelopment. And I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on what you mean by maldevelopment and its various causes and symptoms. Farah, again, a really interesting presentation that I think complemented the other two really well. And one of the things you mentioned that I found intriguing was you talked about young people and the potential for, I think you used the phrase, young people's innovations. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that and how you see the role of youth and also what kinds of innovations might be possible. And then Shahpar, really interesting and absolutely broadened the discussion to bring in issues of culture more widely. And one of the things that you said, that contemporary culture, you said, was perhaps relatively silent. And given the historical importance of environment in Bangladeshi art and poetry, and I wondered if you could maybe talk a little bit more about why, or if that is in fact the case, that today there isn't as much out there as we might expect, in mainstream culture, despite the use of culture by organizations perhaps to try to prompt change on the ground. So those were my various observations and questions, which I hope will kickstart a discussion here. So perhaps we could start and just have speakers' reactions to my questions, and then we can lead into the general questions, which I hope will start coming in soon.
David, do you want to decide what order you'd like the speakers to speak in?
Shall I start?
Yes, I don't have any order in mind. Yes, why don't we take it? Let's take it in the order that people spoke in. That's logical.
Great,
yeah,
thank you very much, David. So let me start by explaining the phrase whole of government, and then move from that to whole of society. Right. So whole of government is the first step that every country has to realize when they deal with the issue of climate change. And historically, over the last several decades that this issue has been brought to our attention, it has started off in departments or ministries of environment within every government in the world. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the annual conference of parties, these were attended by environment ministers, environment departments. And it was a very narrowly focused on the problem being emissions of greenhouse gases and how to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases, which we call mitigation in the climate change parlance. It then moved on to impacts of climate change and the need to adapt to the impacts of climate change. Adaptation brought in the development world, the development actors. Until then, they had been uninvolved. And now I'm postulating we are entering what I call the third era, which is loss and damage. That impacts are real, they're happening, and we have to deal with them. They're beyond adaptation and beyond mitigation. Now, what that has meant in terms of the governance and dealing with this is that ministries of environment were totally inadequate. No ministry of environment in any government, whether it's a developed country or a developing country, has any power. It's a regulatory agency. It might, look at pollution here and there. It doesn't have big budgets. It doesn't have big resources. It can't tell the government what to do, it gets usually ignored by bigger ministries that are involved in planning, economy, finance. So the first realization was environment ministries are the wrong place. They cannot handle climate change. It's too big for them. And so presidents, prime ministers, and particularly finance ministers had to come on into play. And you're seeing that happening now. Boris Johnson is in charge of COP26. Rishi Sunak is in charge of finance. And then they have environment ministers like Alok Sharma, COP presidency, handling the nitty-gritty details. But the big issues are heads of government. Biden in the United States is on board. He is now in charge of this. So that is taking place all over the world. Every country has made that distinction and jump from the issue of climate change being too big to be compartmentalized within the environment ministries or departments of their government. And they have approached a whole of government approach, all right? And Bangladesh was one of the first countries to do this. We do this over a decade ago. Prime Minister of Bangladesh took charge. We developed a climate change strategy and action plan. We have a multi-agency, multi-ministry approach to this. What we are now looking at is going beyond just the different ministries of governments, but bringing in various elements of society as well. And we are very well represented today here by our NGO sector in Bangladesh, one of the most thriving and active civil society sectors, doing a lot of work, particularly at the community level with local adaptation. We are becoming extremely knowledgeable and experienced in doing that. And you have several examples from Khushi and Farah. We also have a very robust academic and research sector. We have an umbrella group called Gobeshona. Gobeshona is a Bangla word for research, where we have more than 50 universities and research institutions involved in doing research, sharing the knowledge, building on that knowledge. We do a big annual conference every January. We've been doing it for the last 6 years. We did it 6 years as a national event. This year, because of COVID, we did it as an online global event on locally led adaptation. So in fact, Bangladesh is now leading the whole world on the concept of locally led adaptation taking place all over the world. We ran it as a 7-day long, 24 hours a day, a virtual session with sessions happening, contributions coming from all over the world during that 7 times 24 hours emerge. The sector that is still behind, you're quite right, is the private sector. And I will divide the private sector into 2 halves. The first half being private sector involved in mitigation or renewable energy. And in that case, globally and in Bangladesh, the renewable energy private sector is moving forward very, very fast. Solar energy, wind energy, technologies on batteries, electric vehicles. The boom in mitigation related private sector globally is very big. In Bangladesh, it's particularly big in the solar home systems. We now have more than 6 million solar home systems providing electricity to 20 million people, primarily developed by private sector companies who are delivering this. On the adaptation side, it's more difficult. There is not a clear case for business profit making on adaptation. Adaptation is about risk management. So we have some insurance companies, we have some agriculture companies. We are exploring how to bring the private sector on adaptation. That's still a lacuna that we haven't solved yet, but something we are working on. And then the final 2 sectors I'll mention is media. Media covers climate change globally, and Bangladesh is very up to speed on our media on top of climate change quite regularly. And young people, the youth, and particularly the school kids. And Farah mentioned the youth that she's been working with and promoting. They are very, very active, both globally under the Fridays for Future movement that is Greta Thunberg's movement, and the Bangladesh chapter of that, and Bangladeshi youth groups very much plugged into that. So that's a sort of a taster of what I'm calling an all of society approach. And I'm arguing that that needs to be done in every country. And then every sector has to connect globally. So school kids globally, academics globally, private sector globally. We need to be having these global all of society approaches to tackling climate change because of the scale of the problem. It's so big that it just not, governments alone cannot do it. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Khushi, would you like to go next? Khushi, we can't hear you. I think you need to unmute.
I'm muted. I really like Salim. He's one of the most positive people I've ever met. I've known him for decades. I won't mention how many decades though. So I don't share his optimism as much as he has given such a rosy and a beautiful picture. I'd just like to say that whereas he's talking about how the heads of governments in different countries, including in Bangladesh, are taking climate change seriously, I don't see its impact and its implementation on the ground in the same level of seriousness, very frankly. Talking about the different ministries having linkages with each other, you have so many, I mean, we've been in movements all the time of very, when you, David, when you mentioned maldevelopment, the kind of industrialization that's taking place, the kind of infrastructure that is being taking place. If you look at the way the roads have been built, which is from east to west, west to east, instead of north to south where the water flows, that has been one of the major reasons for stagnation, etc., which leads to flooding. And people would say, oh, flooding, it's climate change. It's, you know, it isn't. It's because you have planned wrongly. And so for me, the main thing is I would like to see, when you talked about the whole of society approach, Salim, I agree with you. But for me, the whole of society approach is listening to the people and learning from them and then making decisions as to what should be the approach that we use in our country. How do we make the private sector accountable? I did talk about shrimp because that was the film we were showing. But if I see all over agriculture, the whole agriculture production has become commercialized to a market-led agriculture production. Now, your seeds are what you have to buy from the companies. It's the agents who come and sell you the seeds, who give you the funds, or it may be NGOs who give you the funds. It's they decide what the prices are. The fertilizers, the pesticides and insecticides that are being pushed, the kind of mechanization that has come in into even things which used to be women's role in agriculture. So now women are being forced and are part of the agriculture labor system, but they get paid much less. That's, I mean, Farah raised the issue on how patriarchy dominates everything, including what wages are being paid for the same work that women do, etc. And women are now moving into every single area. So for me, the whole of society approach would really mean that making every single sector accountable, including those who we broadly call the civil society, because the civil society is not a homogeneous and a unified unit. We all have differences in our views and our differences in our positions too. But the fact is that we've got to learn to start listening to each other. So you have these seminars, you have webinars now where you can bring everybody in, but no one listens. I mean, if it doesn't make any impact in making changes in your policies, it doesn't have any impact in asking for accountability on what is being done, then that kind of whole of society approach doesn't really function that much. And I think that, like, even with the Right to Information Act, which Bangladesh has passed in 2009, where the people can ask for information from the government and etc. The one sector they cannot, two sectors they cannot ask information from. One is defense, which is for defense reasons, but the other is the private sector. And I don't know why we can't ask information about the private sector. Of course, we have a right to know what they're doing because they're making industries and factories in our land. They're completely controlling the kind of production agriculture systems I will be having, the fishing systems I will be having, the kind of produce where I will sell. I will not be able to sell it in my local market anymore. It has to be the agent who comes and buys it from me. So seeds are no longer what women used to be handling before. All of us are trying to make alternatives, but these alternatives are very minor alternatives, they're small alternatives. And that is not something that is percolating up to the top. We have had discussions where we've had villagers come in and speak to the topmost policymakers, ministers, secretaries, researchers, and they've listened. They could not respond to questions that were asked by the villagers. And when questions were asked to the villagers responded very clearly, very strongly, but none of it made any impact in their in the programs that they were going to be implementing, the kind of policies, even the 8 5-year plan. They said that is going to be, proactive. We are all going to have a say in it. But the plan has been made, and all they did was ask us for being present. So it's like a tick mark of being present as we are there. That happens in development projects where they say there is participation and there is no real participation. So I think we need to restart thinking of these words. And when I talk about maldevelopment, David, I think I've explained a bit. It's maldevelopment because when Farah talked about, and even Shahpar said, and everybody else talked about the kind of the patriarchal attitudes that exist, the class, the gender biases that exist within our systems, we are just reinforcing that. And when it really comes to the crux of the matter, when push comes to shove, you compromise with religious leaders, you compromise with the military bureaucracy, and you compromise most of all with the private sector, not with the people who are the majority in the country, not with them at all. So I think it's very important that we need to, and I would just say a word. I was very interested in Shahpar's talk. Shahpar, thank you very much. It's lovely. I've never heard you give a public talk like that. So it's the first time and it was such a pleasure. But I do think, that I agree with you totally, but there are alternative groups in the cultural sector who are looking at alternatives, but they do remain in the periphery. They're not mainstream. They may be well known, they may be well recognized, but they're not really in the mainstream. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Farah, would you like to just say a few words and then we'll move on to some questions? Well, we'll move on to Shahpar, then we'll move on to some questions.
I will also join Khushi in saying that Shahpar, your presentation was interesting, but this is a kind of land where the local cultural folk culture is very strong, and Rupantor is definitely known for the last 20 years for Potgan and environmental awareness. I mean, I'm happy to see that post 2016 certain projects have come on, but at the indigenous level it was Rupantor. Or when we went into disaster risk awareness, the work we did with all the schools, it was all based on storytelling, on music and songs and art and drawing, even Ludo. We developed a Ludo to raise awareness of students, and it was all about environment, and it's all the information. Then the bank, the oxygen tank, all these are art, craft, that's there. But the sad part is that it's never been taken up at the national level and promoted, because if it had been invested, then it would have, been shared. It would make the whole of the society approach much more meaningful. But anyway, David asked me about young people's innovation. So David, I mentioned that women were at the center and the young people. So every part of our working area, we always come together with young people to try and understand how and what do they understand by these changes, or how is climate? So there was the awareness part, then investing in their ideas and creating the innovative part. And this ranges from solution for water to young women working on agroecology, on seed bank, even basic things like Gono Gavashana, where they've done the community has done the assessment and mapped out the resources and then taken action. Now, over the years, it's become more organized around youth and young people and young hubs. So we support them. So whatever, we have had them coming up with devices or a tracker or an app, because it's very technology based for young people now. And these are the things that we have supported. And so in that sense, we totally believe that they have the scope to come up with new ideas. And unfortunately, the young people's movement and the young people's creativity is not, when it's happening in a developing country, when it's happening somewhere like Bangladesh, it doesn't get the same attention when it happens in the West. And but having said that, we facilitate that there is networking, and it doesn't matter where it happens, but it's taken at that level. And what young people are also doing now is trying to get the political actors to be accountable. So at the local level, they are, so at least the working areas where we work, because Bangladesh has got 170 million people. And if you take all the NGOs together, we wouldn't be more than covering 25% of the country. But anyway, the satisfying part is where we are working, they are holding the local authorities, or they're holding government officials accountable, or they're making demands, they're asking. Sometimes it can be as basic as getting an embankment repaired. So during Ramadan, the women went on the broken embankment and sat there, silent protest, and until the local authorities connected them with the Prime Minister, and they made the demand that this has to be fixed, and it got fixed. But these are just exceptions, or these are examples, but it's encouraging. And from there to, we set up the water museum, and the whole understanding of young people, school students, why water is so significant, what is happening, how things are changing, to advocacies for saving the sanctuary of the fish, in Chittagong, with the Chittagong University. All these initiatives meant long-term investment. And with the young people, they have the ideas. We have to listen, we have to believe, and we have to invest in them. So, and that's how we've found it has worked.
Thank you. Thank you. Shahpar, would you like to just say a few words? Now, we do have some questions, so I don't want to lose the time for questions. So we've only got about 10 minutes left, I think. So Shahpar, do you have any thoughts on whether or not popular culture is responding to climate issues, and if not, why not? I'm wondering if we might have lost Shahpar.
That's what I'm thinking as well. We do have a bit more time.
And why don't you jump in with questions while hopefully Shahpar can reconnect.
We also have about 10 questions now. So
okay, good. Well, as is often the way, they all flood in at the last minute.
They're a bit like buses in London.
Yeah, they are, aren't they? Why don't you be selective and choose? I can't see them obviously, but why don't you choose?
I'll be able to. I'll be able to. They don't. The questions don't come for a while, and then when they come three together. All right. So what I'll do, Shahpar, you're back because we'd lost you. Did you just want to speak briefly to David's initial question, and then we have some questions? Do you want to speak?
It looks like we haven't quite got Shahpar back.
Can you hear? Oh, okay. I'll try and sort this out. Why don't I pose one of the questions? This is actually to everyone, which is, do the panelists think that in our drive for a global approach to tackling climate change, considering the large amounts of donor-driven projects, are we losing our indigenous adaptive mechanisms? If you can keep your answers brief, I can ask more questions.
Actually, why don't you put 3 questions out there, Nilanjan, and then people can jump in and say a few things. Otherwise, we're going to be so short of time, I think.
Okay. I'll give you another one because they're actually pretty large questions.
Yes, they're huge.
Are the speakers optimistic about the success of the climate change response in Bangladesh, including through all of society approach? Is it going to be enough, and is it going to be quickly enough? So you have 2 questions that are addressed to each of you. One is about whether or not the global approach is coming at the cost of indigenous adaptive systems. The other one is the all of society approach. Is it going to be enough, and is it going to be quickly enough? So
can I take the first one? Because I think it also depends on the negotiation capacity. And for development organizations or rights-based organizations, we've designed most of the projects with the community. So it's not that the donors have come and said, you have to do this, and we have done that. So it's about your negotiation and capacity and and the confidence on how it is important, because we had to face a lot of resistance, but we were able to convince that no, it's the community, it's the indigenous understanding that. But this does not mean that we close the door to global knowledge or learnings.
We seem to have some.
I think we have a slight problem with the thing. Shahpar, can you hear us? Yep. Shahpar, can you hear us?
Sounded like a feedback loop.
Yes, I know. Okay, I'm going to try and, so apologies to everyone for that. I'm going to try and sort this out with Shahpar, so I'll disappear from the screen. But Farah, please continue.
So it's also about, the engagement of, if it's coming from the development organizations, it's their engagement and their ability to listen to the communities and enabling their agency so that they can also design the project. But this is on the development side. But when it comes to the government projects, that's where the crux is, where that's the most difficult area. And that takes a lot of lobbying. And as I said, that we have managed to influence the design of the shelters today, and the shelters that are built today in Bangladesh it recognizes the need of people with special needs. It has now much more, it has lights, it has separate facilities for women and girls. This was not there even 10, 15 years ago. So even with whether it's the World Bank funding, whether it's the ADB funding, we managed to put that in there. What is not happening is the projects when it comes to energy sector, because Bangladesh always has an argument that we do have an energy poverty, which is true. I mean, we need more hospitals, we need more, but is it necessary that we make the same mistakes and learn and then go back, or is it not possible to invest in green and modern technology that will so that's where the negotiations come, and we are trying to work collectively with the government to build that confidence that the government can also make the demands, because we should not think that all governments has the specialization or they understand the entire energy discourse, or they're all absolutely familiar and well-versed on climate justice. So people like Salim and many others have brought the science or the experiences from the ground and influencing. And whatever, we are very critical of our government. If it's not about the private sector, then they are much more open. and they have adapted. But with the private sector, there is an attempt now. Like I'm doing a project on earthquake resistance. Prior to that, we were working with the private sector on green. And today there are 9 or 10 garment sector, in the garment sector, these companies have been globally recognized. It's slow, but it's happening.
Good, thank you. Nilanjan, am I right in thinking we only have 3 or 4 minutes left?
No, we can go on for another half.
We can go on for a little bit longer. Okay, good.
Half an hour, yes.
Oh, all right. Okay, good. Okay, so I can relax then. Good. So would anyone else like to jump in with one or other of those questions, or indeed
Shahpar, are you back?
If you're back, Shahpar, you're very welcome to say what you were planning
I'll wait.
to say.
I'll let you.
And then, yes, and then Khushi, why don't you come in? Yeah.
Okay, I'll just take 2 minutes. Thank you so much for David for your excellent question. Why is contemporary culture so silent on climate issues? That's such a great question. I really want people to think about it. See, when we compare contemporary culture, you have to contrast it with earlier culture. And if you look at the culture of Bengal, it had some serious Nobel Prize winning heavy hitters who were acting as climate activists, right? So you can't really now, in fairness, expect more Nobel laureates to come up and talk about.
Oops, we might have lost Shahpar again.
Oh dear, it's so interesting.
About climate struggle. The poet laureate Joshimuddin's heart-rending poems about climate struggle and farmer suicide and those sorts of things, and in our educational curriculum, it was very much a part of who we are as a nation. Now, compared to that, culture has changed like so much of the world, and now popular culture does not have much resonance as much as it used to in the past. Now, why is that? Somehow it's just not sparking enough interest beyond episodic cases. So, there might be like an art festival with a booth on climate change, for example, or there might be special desserts served on Posh Mela, which is like a cultural festival around the time of harvest. So outside of those things, we don't really have anything transformative, right? And why does that happen? One thing has to do with the translation issue, I would assume, because a lot of the Bengali cultural expressions that we have are all in Bengali. So none of this has been really translated into English. Perhaps that would have a wider international reach and kind of inspire new people to think about, oh wow, that this is a really great piece of art and maybe I could take it forwards. So that's there. Linked to that is an issue of intellectual property rights, because who really owns these folk songs and who gets to say them and who gets to take credit for it. So that is something that is a barrier, I think, in amplifying our cultural tools into a climate struggle movement. And lastly, I would say that incentives matter. And right now, we don't have enough sponsorship of what we have in our past. Ask an average person in Dhaka, they're actually not aware that Zainul Abidin's masterpiece scroll called Monpura 1970, which depicts the Bhola cyclone aftermath, there's an entire room in the National Museum in Dhaka that majestically showcases this scroll, and more people need to go see that scroll. But whenever I've been in that room, it's been the crowds haven't been it hasn't never been crowded. So those sorts of things also need to be amplified and brought into our cultural consciousness at the present time.
No, that's really interesting, because it might well be to do with the nature of the way these things are communicated as much to their existence. Because I did some work recently on protest music, and there's a very wide perception in the US that why don't people write lots of protest music the way they did in the 60s about what's going on in the world? And someone went and did a PhD that showed that there was a huge amount of protest music created in the US in opposition to the Iraq war, but far more than in the 1960s. but the nature of the way in which the media works, but also the very compartmentalized ways in which those, musics are shared in the internet, and the nature, the changing nature of radio, and all of those factors around production and commodification and consumption were working against the fact that that vast amount of cultural expression was not necessarily widely heard or assumed to be there. That's a completely different example, taking us off subject, but I think it speaks to the fact that perhaps there is all kinds of cultural production going on, but it might not necessarily be resonating beyond, certain communities, or between the urban and the rural, or between different, types of audiences.
And also the Robert Murdoch phenomena, who is taking over the media and producing things that, we are watching and seeing. So that's also.
Yes, absolutely. So let's hand over to Khushi.
When Shahpar was speaking, I was just thinking of how, and what you said also, how compartmentalized and how things are controlled and projected. I mean, there is a lot that is happening that is, and there's a system that when I hear young kids in the villages making their own rap songs with rap as I just had asking them, where did you learn rap? This is remote villages. So there's some system through which this kind of protest, culture tracks across, but it's not something that we see in the mainstream. They're not promoted by houses that are promoting culture. Abidin Sir's famine sketches on the Monpura brick scroll was not commissioned by anybody. It was him feeling the need to do it. So I think there is a difference between now everything being commissioned, and the same thing with the museum. The museum doesn't project anything. I mean, forget Abidin Sir's thing. They don't project anything about what the museum is about. I mean, there's really a need. That's why I think that whatever is happening, there's a great divide. There's a great divide between what people actually on the ground are looking, thinking, doing, acting, and what is happening. I just feel that when Farah was talking, it was really important, especially I think when she talked about how the change in the structure of the cyclone shelters have been, they've been able to impact that. And I really want to thank you for that, because as someone who's been through many cyclones and seen what the cyclone shelters used to be like, and the kind of horrifying tales. There's a book that was edited by Hamida, and I don't remember who else, that had stories of the 91 cyclone. And I remember I had a little piece about how women felt so insecure within the cyclone shelters. So that has changed, like how the shelters were huge structures that were far away. So yes, thank you very much. But I just wanted to say that in terms of, actually the projects being taken up by the government, they are influenced by commercial interests. The commercial interests are the ones who influence the ministries, and the ministries are the ones who are influenced by what will work and will not. So yes, you have some aspects which look after the kinds of needs we are talking about, but there's larger concerns that really affect us so badly. And when Shahpar was talking about the climate struggles and then there's a difference between the climate struggles and the climate change. So I think one has to understand there's a difference. The climate struggle is something that we were, because this is a very active delta. And as an active delta, the rivers, the forests, the way of movement and everything was dependent. And now because of silting and whatever and changes in the way the rivers move, the silting and the rivers having died completely. People having, when Farah was talking about people having to change houses, I remember in the 70s and 80s, I met people who had shifted houses about 8-9 times. Climate change was not an issue at that time. It was because the river erosion made them move their houses. So often it was people taking over their land. It was the occupation of the land. But very often it was river erosion too. So that was something that if you read the novels of the early this century or even thing, you'd find that the Nodi and the river and people and how it creates this difference. I mean, almost every novelist worth their name has written about the rivers and the erosion and their life over there. And it's in all our songs. It's all in our poems. So all that is different. I think what has happened now is we think that these things are no longer existing is because the commercialization, the commoditization of culture and the decision of what constitutes development, what doesn't, what is for people's benefit and what is not, is all controlled by a certain group. And this group are totally removed and totally separate from the people. Once in a while, yes, we get them together. And those are the tokenisms that need to show that, yes, this is happening. But in actual fact, until people start acting. And I'd just like to say that when we began with that Amphan video, which I had shown, I wanted to say, and I didn't say it then, I forgot, that is what Bangladesh 50 years ago was, people getting together to fight the liberation struggle. And again, when there is any crisis, people get together to fight that crisis. And that is what Bangladesh can teach the world. And I see 50 years from now, I hope this culture of ours will continue, where people get together to fight and create the solution.
Thank you very much, Khushi. I'm sorry, I'm going to, I'm just interjecting because we have quite a few questions. Can I just ask, did anyone address the question even briefly about the all of society approach?
I thought when I spoke about it,
I think Khushi had a pretty good go at that one.
Fine, that's fine. There are more questions. There are more.
Yeah. I think so much so that Salim's disappeared. But no, I know he had another meeting to go to.
Okay.
But no, I thought that was a really excellent contribution.
Okay. There are quite a few other questions. I'm going to put them in. I'm going to take them apart and put them together again for clarity's sake. Shahpar, I'll just say, one is if all of you could just keep your answers very brief. And Shahpar, in your case, your connection being the weakest, if it begins to flicker, just switch off your camera so at least we can hear you. You don't have to do it now, but if it begins to flicker. So this is a question for actually all three of you. That is for Farah, for Khushi, and for Shahpar. One is, so I'm going to read out the question. Reports show that women and children are more likely to die from natural hazards, and it was mentioned that patriarchal cultural norms play a part in this. Do you have examples of measures taken in Bangladesh to tackle this issue of gender inequalities in responding to adapting to events such as cyclones? So the question of more women and children dying and etc. And I don't know, Farah, do you want to go first?
Thank you. On the whole, we have managed to bring down the mortality rate. Now people don't die from floods and cyclones at the rate that we had seen in 1970, even in 1991. So when we talk about disaster risk management or disaster management, this is a Bangladesh achievement. And it cuts across everyone. Now, when we talk about the gender dimension, we still find that women are supposed to be the custodian of all our culture and values. So they are asked to leave as the last resort. And because of that, it does have it does impact them, and the vulnerability in comparison to men is still higher. Then there were issues and many research about how a sari is a problem and you get entangled in sari and water and so on. I, being someone who wears sari, I have never found that a problem. But of course, I've not been in a cyclone directly. So I think people anyway have switched, and their attire and clothing has changed, and there's so much influence of. Anyway, so the point here is that we have addressed this by developing skills. So women don't know how to swim, so there's been investment of trying to build, even though it's a riverine country, there are many parts of the country where women and girls, because of not being allowed to go on land, so targeted measures have been taken, and then trying to reach the information to them, because early warning made no sense to the way it was messaged before to the women and the girls. They never got it. They don't come to the tea stall. They don't, it was not directed, but all that has changed through FM radio, through targeted messaging. But the patriarchy has not gone away. So whether a woman can step out of her home is still being decided by the men in that area. Whether if she feels confident that she will not be at risk of gender-based violence is still there. And we have reports of gender-based violence. In the midst of pandemic, the highest rate of gender-based violence has occurred. So you take 5 steps forward and then you go 50 steps backward because of patriarchy and the practices and the culture and the control and power dynamics.
Thank you. Khushi, did you want to speak briefly, and then we can invite Shahpar?
Very briefly, whereas I agree with Farah on many of the issues, especially women being the last to leave, they themselves also feel that they need to be there to protect the house and the whatever it is before, because very often when they've gone because of the warning, they've come back and everything's been looted. And so they feel the need for that. I found that one of the biggest reasons for women being affected most is the thatch roof versus the tin roof. The thatch roof has been totally, it's been replaced by the tin roof. Before, like in the earlier cyclones, etc., even in the floods, we found that women could sit on the thatch and then float, and that's how they survived. With the tin roof, the tin can even mangle, it mangles and it even can hurt you. You can get killed is extreme, but it's there. So that is there. And the swimming, before I saw in the villages, all the women could swim, but now every pond has been taken and every water body has been taken for commercial fish culture. So you don't have a place to learn swimming. Even the kids are not learning swimming in the villages anymore. So I think when you ask me, David, what I meant by marriage development, every answer I'll give will tell you a little bit about the marriage development. So yeah, I'll say that it is the patriarchal culture. It is also the kind of development paradigm that we have imposed that is pushing people into this kind of a more vulnerable situation, and women being the ones that are still the ones who are the caregivers, they are the ones who leave last and therefore the most vulnerable.
Okay, great, thank you, because you've actually answered another of the questions, which was on, let me just say the question so the person knows. This is a question about what are the limitations of pursuing climate adaptation in conjunction with development, considering the maldevelopment that was being discussed. So you've just spoken. Shahpar, would you like to answer? And please do switch on your camera so we can see you, and the audience can see you as well, because when you switch off your camera, you disappear from YouTube.
Actually, no, I think Khushi Kabir and Farah Kabir have answered it brilliantly. I don't have anything else to add.
Okay, well, there is one that is directed towards you, so you might as well answer that, which is, apart from pot gun, what other forms of arts do you think can be used for climate campaigning? Shahpar.
Goodness. Oh gosh, that's a really great question. Thank you so much. What other forms? Well, really depends on how you define culture these days, because the broader the church, the more people, the more disciples you have. So what is a form of culture? Depends on what all you're adding to the definition, really. One example off the top of my head is TikTok. Is it culture? I don't know. Just because I don't get it doesn't mean it's not culture. It's what the kids are into these days. And as Khushi Kabir was saying, that she was surprised to find that rural village children knew how to rap. And so this is how culture is just evolving. So what other forms that we have to take forward climate activism really depends on what are the new forms young kids these days are coming up with. One thing I would be very happy to see if this actually happens, a new form, is to take to have more attention on religious forms of communicating culture, climate change. Because what we have seen repeatedly is that if you can get the religious people at the village level on board, you get your climate, your disaster warnings across much sooner. So maybe something that we can look into much more. And this actually, there's an example for this. Deutsche Welle did a project in Indonesia and in Pakistan where they looked at eco-Islam. So they took out eco-friendly messages from Islam and they used it to generate people's interest into making more eco-friendly choices in their lives. So that's something else that we could explore as well. So yes, religion and TikTok.
All right, well, there's some ideas. Okay, one last question. This is actually for
Can I just come in, because I have a little disagreement with Shahpar on the religious issue. I think Indonesia and Pakistan are a totally different culturally than Bangladesh. The way the religious leaders have behaved recently and what has been seen in the madrasas and what has been happening, and my own experience of being in the village, I don't think the religious, we in the cities have given them much a higher position within the villages that the village itself gives them. So yes, they can be used. I think there's nothing wrong in them being used, but I don't think they are the ones that really decide. This can be projected through many other ways, like popular, having folk songs, popular songs, Ganushongit as it is, the people's songs and all that. A little drama, etc., theater, things like that can easily be used.
All right. The last question is, are Bangladesh, and I would actually say, David, if you would like to say something as well, are Bangladesh policymakers prioritizing tourism and development over indigenous communities and the natural environment? And how do we decolonize the fight against climate change? Now, this is I emphasize the word decolonize because earlier this afternoon, David and I met for a cup of tea, and we were actually talking about the way in which the term decolonize is being used nowadays in multiple settings, and how it actually means different things in different settings. My background is in history, where decolonizing means something very, very particular and specific. So would each of you like to speak briefly on this? I'll just read it out again. Are Bangladesh policymakers prioritizing tourism and development over indigenous communities and the natural environment? And how do we decolonize the fight against climate change? Farah, would you like to go first?
Tourism industry as such has not flourished in a major way in Bangladesh. I think given that we have Cox's Bazar and others, they could have been much more planned and so on. So that's a different discussion. Over indigenous communities, yes, there has been occasions where particular indigenous communities have been affected because of, again, it's the global nature of we're coming in for development and you'll have employment and so on and so forth, but it's impacted on the indigenous way of life and so on. So that Bangladesh is guilty of that. But tourism industry as a whole is not very big or has not developed. I mean, in 50 years, places like Cox's Bazar or some of the coastal areas could have developed much more. Now, and it's always that it's a sword, you know, the twin-edged sword, because if you go for development, then you're going to be destroying. Unless right now there's a big fight in the city because in a particular place where Independence Declaration and all, Sarvadi Uddan, that they're cutting down the trees. And so why? Because they're going to create development and so on. So that means the green lobby, the young climate activists, they all went in and they started, protecting, holding on to the trees and saying, no, if you want to develop, you can keep the trees, design it, and architects and so on. So they are also part of the movement. And of course, you have the other architects on the other side where they want to clean everything and build the road. So it does come at a cost, but I think Bangladesh's tourism industry is not so strong. I would like to see it much more eco and developed and planned and so on.
Khushi, do you want to go for it?
Come in? Yeah. At this present moment, there's a movement that's amongst the many movements that I'm also actively involved in, is in the hill tracts in the Bandarbon area. There's a huge tract of the Mro community. That's one of the the smallest indigenous communities in the Chittagong hill tracts, who are all being wiped off their land from the ancestral land, because there's going to be a huge development project there by the army and the Marriott hotels. We have had a movement in getting everyone to start asking the Marriott hotels, who said that they have not signed contracts, and yet their names are up there. So they haven't even done a case as to why is their name up there. So this, and now it's all been cordoned off. So we don't even know what is happening in that area or not. Before it was open, so we knew what was happening. So this is totally at the cost of the local people, and this tourism industry is not going to help the local people at all. Similarly, there are many other areas where the tourism is being planned, which is destroying the local community and industries. I think, again, as the first thing that I did mention was having local communities talk about, and especially the most marginalized, as to what it means to them and how it is, what is happening to them. We don't want this kind of development to happen, which is at the cost of the people itself. Farah mentioned the Sarvadi Uddan, and basically the whole thing is that it was to, the ones they're trying to cut down now is to build a food court. I mean, the Sarvadi Uddan is a historic space, and we agree to that being protected and projected, but a food court doesn't do anything on that count at all. And in your question about that, the decolonization issue, I think every word I find is being totally changed. I mean, I talk about intersectionality now being used by mainstream development, USAID and World Bank, context from what the feminists with the intersectionality issue of how the feminist intersectionality is moving. So I think there are many different words that gets totally changed, and we have to be very careful. I think we have to be aware of the origins of the word, how it is used, and how words can change, and we have to be very clear politically as to what the word means where we are concerned. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Shahpar, briefly, and then I'll give David the last word.
I actually don't know enough about decolonization to really have an informed opinion on it, and I defer to my fellow panelists. They've already covered it so well, so thank you.
That's okay. If I may, I've got a couple of things that I would add to that, and perhaps this will be the the final part of the session. But I think it's a really interesting question about decolonizing, and And I think it's such a complicated subject, as Nilanjan and I were talking about this afternoon over tea. I mean, in the context of, I think, our discussion, I can think of several different dimensions to this. I mean, one of them is about looking at the structures of power around the way that the international donors and development agencies act within Bangladesh. And obviously there's, we've heard today quite a lot about the way in which those relationships have been contested and in many cases renegotiated, and whether we're talking about the ways in which civil society has challenged those dominant development models, or whether we're talking about, from Salim's conversation about the relationship between universities in the UK and in Bangladesh changing from one of external capacity building and funding to one of cooperation and partnership and exchange. I mean, those are all, I think, part of the decolonizing debate. But I think another important part of it is also about challenging the relics of colonialism that are still there and are still important, whether we're talking about the sorts of laws that have been on the statute books for decades, which have origins in colonial law, whether we're talking about some of the structures of the way, for example, local government operates and the way in which, government authority, I mean, all of those things go back to the colonial era and need challenging. The education system and the use of education as an instrumental tool rather than one for empowering and educating and opening up people's lives. And of course, the discourse of indigenous people is another important mindset of exclusion that also relates back to colonial policies. So I think it's a theme for another panel. It would be a fantastic title, I think, for a discussion around decolonization and climate action. But unfortunately, it's not one that we can go into in huge amount of more detail today. But I would just like to thank everybody for a really stimulating discussion, really interesting, and some fantastic questions from the audience. And I hope that everybody has got something to take away from today's discussion. So I think I'm going to bring things to a close there and just hand over to Nilanjan to say the final words. But thank you so much, everybody. I've really enjoyed it, and I think we've covered a lot of really important ground.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you to David and to Salim for actually having co-organized this. It takes months for us to put this together. Thank you also to Khushi Kabir and to Farah Kabir and to Shahpar for your participation, for your time. I'm aware it is very late in Dhaka at the moment. Salim had to leave slightly early because he has another event to go to. I just wanted to say a couple of things in terms of, before I said goodbye. I also want to thank the audience who have been very loyal across the globe, who've been watching us all through the event. 2 hours is a long time to watch an event online. One is a very important point that Khushi made, which was the gap between the initiatives, the very creative and effective initiatives that are happening at grassroots levels through the work of NGOs and civil society organizations, and why they don't escalate upwards into policy. That there aren't even dotted lines. It's a very common thing in South Asia. Bangladesh is not special because of this, that governments and governmental departments and all will acknowledge the work that is being done at the grassroots level. And yet when they come out with their policies and with their papers, it's like you were on another planet. And this is an issue that we want to explore next year in some of our events, is can higher education institutions who are outside both the sectors of non-government organizations and civil society organizations on the one hand, and the government on the other, can higher education institutions play any role in creating even a dotted line between these two? It's something that we have been discussing in the context of several South Asian countries. But thank you very much. You made that point very, very eloquently. And no doubt from your own experience, but it was a very important point to make. The second thing I wanted to say was about decolonization, what David said just now. We are, the whole question of decolonization has now come to the level of actually whether or not knowledge needs to be decolonized. So it's not a question of decolonizing law or decolonizing history, it's a question of a worldview. And a worldview that is actually changing even from within. David and I, in the 19th century, phraseology, David and I are in the metropole, which is London. And yet changes that happen over here, even in law, do not get reflected or enacted in the former colonies or what we call the post-colonial nations. So I think there is a lot of debate to be had about how we refine and engage with knowledge that is available to us across the world and adapt and implement it for the larger benefit of the communities that are both specific and general to the South Asian region. But on that note, thank you very much. This has been absolutely great. We have gone over 2 hours. That is a rarity. It shows you how great it has been. And I'm sure there will be more occasions to do similar events, but for the moment, goodbye.